On August 10th, Churchill choreographed a church service on the deck of the HMS Prince of Wales.
They sing, "O God, our help in ages past, eternal Father strong to save, and onward Christian soldiers." The lesson is from Joshua. All these words, the Lord's Prayer, all these words would have evoked in Roosevelt memories of the places where he had learned them and most often repeated them, which was the universe he would most want to protect from harm.
As FDR's ship sailed away, the Prime Minister turned to an aide and remarked that it had been a great hour to live. But the central issue remained. Would Roosevelt get into the fight against Hitler soon enough to make a decisive difference? Then, on September 4th, an event out in the mid-Atlantic appeared to hand Roosevelt the pretext he needed. A German submarine fired on the USS Greer.
I tell you the blunt fact that the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer without warning and with deliberate design to sink her.
But the Greer hadn't sunk, and there was no demand for retribution from the American public. Roosevelt would now have to balance the demands of a succession of international crises with a devastating personal loss. 3 days after the Greer attack, Roosevelt was summoned to Hyde Park to be at his mother's side as she lay dying. All his life, they had an unbreakable alliance and a powerful interdependence, a bond that excluded all others, including Eleanor. Sarah Roosevelt was buried 2 days later next to her husband in the country churchyard at St. John's Episcopal.
He was in public stoical during his mother's funeral and stood stoically by the graveside as she was lowered into the tomb. But a couple of days later, his secretary, Grace Tully, was going through some things in the house, and she found a box, and in that box was a little snippet of FDR's hair that his mother had kept. And she brought him the box, and she looked up and he was weeping.
In quiet moments during the years that followed, he asked his daughter Anna to take him to the gravesite, where he would sit for hours. In a world where the future seemed so uncertain, Roosevelt found security and solace in the past. He knew the future was fraught with dangers and challenges he could not control. But in his darkest hour, FDR could not imagine the scale of the carnage that was about to be sustained by his beloved Navy. As Roosevelt fretted about prospects of being sucked into a European war, the situation in the Pacific was reaching crisis point. Since the early 1930s, when Japan invaded Manchuria, the United States had watched with increasing alarm, but had done little to intervene. By 1940, continued Japanese aggression in Asia led Roosevelt to impose a trade embargo against Tokyo. In this White House recording, made at 4:20 on the afternoon of October 8, 1940, FDR is heard reading a Scripps-Howard dispatch out of Tokyo to his White House staff. The report details the demands Japan was making of the U.S.
A condition of staying out of war is that the United States will recognize the new era in the Far East, and that in token of that recognition, the United States must abandon its bases, military or naval bases, in Guam, Midway, Pearl Harbor, and Kuwait, including Pearl Harbor. That's giving up Hawaii. Well, that's the first time that any damn Jack told us to get out of Hawaii.
However, he remained convinced that the principal danger to America lay in Europe, not the Far East. In late summer 1941, Roosevelt turned to the military. He asked them to estimate how many men it would take to defeat Hitler and how long before U.S. forces could launch a counterstrike across the English Channel. Coordinating the study was Henry Stimson, FDR's Secretary of War and the administration's most senior Republican. The top-secret report, presented to Roosevelt at the beginning of December 1941, was codenamed Rainbow 5.
the assumption was that if war came on two fronts, if the United States found itself in a war with both Japan and Germany at the same time, the allocation of resources would be 85% to the European or German theater and 15% to the Pacific, where the United States agreed to fight only a defensive or a holding action until the war against Germany was successfully concluded.
To fight the war against Germany, Rainbow Five called for the creation of a 5 million strong expeditionary force. Those men would be ready to lead an invasion across the English Channel by the summer of 1943. Few in Washington knew about the report. Few, that is, until the whole plan was leaked to the Chicago Tribune.
On December 4th, 3 days before Pearl Harbor, the Chicago Tribune came out with gigantic headlines: Roosevelt's war plan. This was supposedly a plan that armed services all agreed with, and it was a huge uproar. The America First people said this proved Roosevelt was a liar, you know, and pointed to his saying he never sent somebody to foreign wars, and it was signed by Roosevelt, this war plan. It was a fantastic gamble on Roosevelt's part.
A gamble because General Albert Wiedemeyer, the original architect of the plan, became convinced that the president was responsible for the leak. Wiedemeyer believed this was part of Roosevelt's clandestine campaign to get Germany to declare war on the United States first. 3 days later, Roosevelt would have his war, but not the one he expected or wanted to fight.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special broadcast.
The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii from the air.
The attack shattered America's sense of invulnerability. 184 aircraft, launched from 6 Japanese carriers, caught the Pacific Fleet unaware. The USS California, West Virginia, and Arizona were sunk. 2,403 lives were lost. As the news came in from Hawaii, those around FDR, including Eleanor, observed an inscrutable level of detachment.
When I did go in, I thought him looking very strained and tired, but he was completely calm. He just became almost like an iceberg, and there was never the slightest emotion.
A suspicion emerged in the immediate aftermath of the attack that Roosevelt ignored intelligence warnings of the raid in order to finally have an incident that would propel the country into war. No compelling evidence to that effect has surfaced. Roosevelt and his generals did suspect the Japanese might try something, but not an attack of this scale and not directed at the heart of America's Pacific Fleet. The attack transformed the American political landscape. Isolationism collapsed overnight. On December 8, 1941, the Commander-in-Chief went before a joint session of a united Congress to rally a nation for war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
But one of the immediate problems Roosevelt faced was that the carnage was in Pearl Harbor, and that didn't fit the Rainbow Five scenario.
There's a moment, a very frightful moment for Roosevelt and especially for Churchill, when they think that the cry for vengeance from the American public will be so irresistible that they will be compelled, Roosevelt will be compelled, to wage a premature war on a larger scale in the Pacific than sound strategic doctrine held.
Winning the military over to this European strategy was made significantly easier for Roosevelt when Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States just 4 days after Pearl Harbor. 11